Okay, now we are going to use these two plans from Palladio to analyze and read these two diagrammatically. We know that Rudolf Whitcover, in his book of Architectural Principles in the Age of Humanism, analyzed Palladian villas through diagrams, which I encourage you to have a look, and we discussed some of these ideas. But we are going to use the analysis that he did and some other authors that looked at Palladian villas. We are going to use those analyses and add our interpretation to it. So, like all other workshops and the tasks that you are doing or you in your design studio, you can always look at the literature. You can always look at what other people have done and use it as a starting point. Not only to copy, but sometimes a good idea to add your interpretation and your imagination to it. For this case, you can follow me, do some of these diagrams similar to what I do here, and then go on and use your interpretation to read the buildings diagrammatically. So let's start by looking at the major spaces, the main spaces of the building, and then we are going to look at the geometrical relationships between these main spaces and the service areas and the circulation. We are going to look at the thresholds. They are quite different. And also we are going to look at the hierarchy as well. And then you take this on board, maybe you can add to it. And that would be really interesting to see different diagrams than what I do here from you and the way that you read it. You don't need to print it. Like me, you can trace over your screen, your iPad, your laptop. I'm going to just use this four square. I'm just going to start drawing on, tracing over these. We can see these four square sensitivity again. He used, and within these four squares, you can see that the central square there, which kind of interlocks these four squares and acts as a service area, if you like, as opposed to these main spaces that is got there. So if we have these main spaces, so major spaces, and we can add a legend there that this thick line represents major spaces. Or we can call it main spaces. I'm going to turn this one on to see if it's better. Okay. And then we can see that there is this central space which kind of hides away these staircases here. So that these service or vertical circulations or service areas, so if you call these one service areas or service spaces. And we've got this central element and the corridors connecting these. And when we move to showing the thresholds, we can add these elements and how these play into the geometrical aspect. And we can mark that as circulation. And then when we look at Villa Foscari, we can see the relationship between major or main spaces, service or vertical circulation and horizontal circulation is different. So if we were to diagrammatically look at this one, it's a more kind of a straightforward. We've got the major spaces, we've got this service or the service spaces and the staircase, and we've got this central circulation, which is kind of well defined. Again, as we move on to look at the threshold, that becomes more kind of interesting to look at these two. So now if you go kind of back to Rudolf Ritkower's analysis of Palladian villas, we are going to look at the geometrical pattern of these two, kind of comparing them together diagrammatically, looking at them, how different they are. One of the things that you can see in this straightforward is that the geometrical pattern here is quite symmetrical in the x and y axes, whereas it's slightly different in the malcontenta, which we are now going to use some of the analysis by Ritkower. If you look at Villa Capra, the way that Rudolf Ritkower analyzed the geometrical pattern, it's quite a kind of fairly simple to see, but when you analyze it with the rest of the villas and compare it, then that becomes kind of intriguing and interesting to read these different geometrical patterns. So let's go ahead and quickly look at this kind of a geometrical pattern that gets repeated here. And we are going to make these bold so that we can see that better. To see that the repetition of that language is quite interesting, and that creation of a geometrical pattern which is harmonious, and it's quite different to the Malcontenta villa or Villa Foscari. So they had two names based on the client name and the location. So Foscari and Malcontenta is the same. So looking at this, the geometrical pattern as Rudolf Ritkower analyzed this particular building, and he's analyzing this in a kind of a more of a slightly different than Villa Capra, because in Villa Capra we can see that very symmetrical geometrical pattern, which we don't see that strong geometrical pattern in the Villa Foscari. So moving into this one, we can see here he's starting to kind of play that proportion of 2, 2 and 1.5, 2, 1, 2, 1 and 2. You might remember some of it from previous workshops. And then the geometrical pattern kind of follows that rule of proportions that he invented. We can see that the 2 2 and 1.5 here. So if I was to thicken up some of these to make it easier to read. I'm going to just do this line with a lighter pen, and these ones. So if you look at the geometrical pattern here, we see the difference, but at the same time we see that the way that he's playing with the proportions and geometrical patterns, they follow that proportional sensitivity of Palladian. So I'm going to add my interpretation. I'm just going to put this here. I want to destroy my screen and use my compass here. Just first of all, I'm going to find a central point and think about that actually as a radius. Going back to this here, you can see that circle, a central circle here that I've just drawn. And looking at this circle, where it ends is where the steps end as well. So the center of that space, the steps, so if you were to draw those central lines, let me grab this one. So if you were to draw those central lines here, you can see that the starting point of these steps towards the house, the villa, and where they end, and you've got this space, the threshold, if you like. We are going to look at that in a minute. That creates this diamond, which is a 45-degree rotation of that square. Let me go ahead and maybe thicken up some of these lines. And we can see that these symmetrical pattern emerging there as well, making it easier to see now. And then we can start thinking about how these steps come into play, how these entrances or thresholds come into play with this geometry. By kind of emphasizing on some of the main geometrical patterns as we are drawing on or tracing over that, we are tracing over the main geometrical patterns that we want to show and we want to emphasize on. And then looking at Villa Foscari, we can start reading the square root of 2 that we earlier introduced in the composition workshop. We can start reading that here. And then we've got this square, which is 5.5 unit by 5.5, so it's 5, this is the half of the 1 unit, and then we are going to put our, I'm sure you remember how to do the square root of 2, and start that. And for a diagram is pretty accurate. So if I was to draw that diagonal here in the arc, achieve that square root of 2 here. So it's slightly different, although he's using his proportions square and his Palladian proportions, but it's different than the Villa Capra and his other villas as well. And then if you want to go ahead and look at the range of spaces and the threshold, so if we can call this one a geometrical pattern diagram. So each time I'm going to use a different diagram to do my next diagram. For instance, I would like to use this one to look at circulation and the movement, and I would use this one to show the threshold. So again, I'm going to put another tracing paper. The difference between the threshold and entrances. So you can see that this building actually is quite inviting, if you like, as opposed to this, which would require you to stop here. It's a more of an official entrance, and perhaps arguably less inviting than this one. And that can be actually a reason for why, how you think about a threshold, really. Maybe he didn't think that way, but the reading of these two plans suggests that you have got the entrance or the thresholds from 4 sides, whereas you've got the one side entrance. Looking at it again here, we can see that these entrances are very kind of informal, if you like, when you compare them with these two. I mean, both of them, you can see that point of kind of arrival, if you like, here. So you've got to stop there somewhere before you are allowed to enter the building. Very much similar here, that this is the point of arrival before you enter the building. But the introduction to the building and the threshold is quite different. And one can argue that probably this is kind of a more secure, if you like. The security is higher here than, and that is more inviting from either side. I mean, don't take it literal about the security thing, but the way that a visitor is introduced to this building or a visitor enters the building is quite different experience than this building. And one can kind of further analyze the movement inside and how this relates to the internal movement. So what we are going to do, we are going to look at the internal navigation and movement. So if we call this one a threshold or a diagram of threshold, and then so these are the arrival, and then here you stop, and then all these points where you stop before you are introduced to the building. And again, you can have a legend to explain that there. So I'm going to get another tracing paper, and this time I'm going to look at these together somehow. But I know about this grid now, so let's put it aside. Let's have a look at it. I'll have it next to me there, and then start thinking about the movement inside and how you navigate through the spaces. A closer look at this, we can see that as we are introduced to this building, again there are points where we stop, and I'm going to show these with kind of these dots here. The moment that stop happens as you move to the building or either side. So we had this diagram showing the introduction to the building, if you like. You're being introduced to the building, so the threshold from outside towards the interior. And here we've got the points, the journey, and the points that where you stop within the building after you've been introduced to the building as a visitor, if you like. And again, you have these axes, these strong axes that one can argue that one of the axes in terms of the internal movement is stronger than the other. But we have looked at the geometrical pattern where we agreed that it's quite a symmetrical building. But then when we look in more detail, these deployment of four square sensitivity that Palladian introduced, when he starts putting these major spaces there, we can see that these squares now they have a stronger rectangular major spaces within them, which can be argued that these internal axes are stronger than these. As you get introduced to the building, obviously, these two axes are quite strong in terms of the movement, but one can argue that these rectangular forms create a stronger axis towards this direction. And moving on from that, we can see that if as we move into space there, I'm going to show these dotted lines as we move, and obviously that pretty much happens in all directions, very much similar to what we said earlier about the threshold and the entrance. And then moving into these spaces as well, as we said, has a strong axes here this way. And we can see that this started actually to look at argument that these axes are stronger. We can see that through this diagram now. Before this diagram, we thought, well, both axes are strong, but as we look at it more carefully internally, we can see that the movement internally within the spaces inside the building happen through this direction, and that has a stronger dominance in terms of the different axes. And obviously we've got these two spaces. And that is the diagram of internal movement. And again, I'm going to draw the major spaces that we drew first, and that can be hierarchy of spaces. And with the green, if you can see the different colors, I'm not sure, you can see the point of where you stop and where you move. And again, that can be added to your diagram. So that the previous one looked at the external threshold and the threshold towards the building externally, and that looks at internal movement and that sequence and that spatial sequence. So let's look at this one now. So what we said that we get introduced to the building slightly, or maybe quite different to that one. And let's see how the internal spaces work and the internal movement works. Again, we are going to show where we stop with these dots here. And again, a very dominant central axis here. And the spaces there. And there. But we can see that this starts to kind of have a slightly stronger or maybe more balanced X and Y axis than this one. And these two spaces, obviously. And again, I'm going to add these spaces there where that circulation happens. So we can call this one a internal movement or spatial movement or internal spatial movement diagram. And well, we used some of the analysis of Rudolf Virchow, and we added some of the interpretation and reading of the building from what we thought and we could read from these plans. So what I want you to do is to add your interpretation, maybe add one or two more diagrams. Let's recap what we've done. So we looked at the hierarchy of spaces, major spaces, services, circulations. We looked at geometrical grid. We looked at geometrical patterns. We looked at threshold, and we looked at internal movement and spatial circulation. So there are more diagrams that we can do to analyze this building. And you can start annotating them as well. Not only the diagrams themselves, but the annotation can help. Make sure that your annotations don't overwhelm the diagrams and the drawings, and the drawings and the diagrams are the main aspect.